After one-tricking Merlin for a year, I decided to learn Fire Aggro Xander, aka FiZa, and it was going terribly. I eventually realized that my biggest issue was just that I didn't know my lines. You see, FiZa lines can get pretty tricky, since his signature regalia, the Poison Dagger, flips the normal damage math on its head. It's a card that amplifies all the damage that he and his allies deal for one turn, but it is heavily weighted towards making small and otherwise innocuous hits into serious threats. Furthermore, it benefits greatly from planning out your allies, graveyard, spells, and influence over the course of 3 turns. So I was having a lot of trouble even just figuring out how much damage FiZa was capable of. And to make things worse, I didn't even have a way to know if the lines that I was coming up with were even correct. And given how much I was losing at locals, I was sure that my answers were not correct. A big issue since the Texas regionals were fast approaching. So with my back against the chair, I had a moment of realization. From that moment, I understood the weakness of my flesh, and it disgusted me. What I craved was the strength and certainty of steel. I aspired to the mathematical correctness of a blessed machine. It was a mistake to cling to my flesh as it had failed me, but I could still be saved. I could replace my weak flesh brain with a machine's 4.2 gigahertz of unrelenting determination, capable of finding the true lines, capable of finding the mathematically correct FiZa lines. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what that actually means. Basically, it means that I'm a huge nerd that turned finding FiZa lines into a computer optimization problem. So instead of using my flesh brain that only might be right about the highest 3-turn and 2-turn lines, I could use my steel brain to know with mathematical certainty that any other line would, at best, be tied in damage with the lines that I was practicing. So let's get into the details. At a high level, all my steel brain is really doing is trying every possible 3-turn line for a given 7-card hand, or trying every possible 2-turn line for a given 8-card hand, and then reporting a maximum damage line. And I know that sounds like a pretty simple plan, but this is much easier said than done. Programs like these can be really hard to debug due to the sheer volume and depth of the function calls they make, and mathematically correct FiZa was no different. At minimum, exploring tens of billions of game states for each hand. And with billions of game states being explored, it would also pretty easily take a stupidly long time to run. That is, if you don't add optimizations to skip redoing work or skip obviously bad lines, like making an ally and then just never attacking with it. But we're starting to get a little bit ahead of ourselves. The most important place to start with these kinds of projects is making something that definitely works, since it's much better to have a program that's slow but correct than one that is fast but totally useless. So I spent about 2 weeks implementing all the allies, actions, attacks, and regalia from Thick Opie's Ascent Seattle list, so that they could be used with the Maximin algorithm to simulate Grand Archive, or at least the parts that I needed. But this actually presents a pretty major issue. The Maximin algorithm is a technique used to figure out what the best moves for each player would be in a 1 versus 1 game with complete information like chess. The name comes from the player trying to maximize their minimum gains, or in this case, trying to maximize the minimum possible damage. But all I have is player 1. Player 2 could be any other deck. Fractals, Wind Allies, Fire Arcane Rye, anything. However, there was no way I would have time to implement every other deck in Grand Archive. Additionally, Maximin assumes that you have complete information, which in this case would mean knowing what cards are in your opponent's hand, memory, and on the top of their deck, an assumption that just is completely unrealistic in a real game. But here's the thing, I can't just ignore the second player to fix the problem. I need some amount of interaction so that the lines are realistic. So I decided to make a heuristic. Now, a heuristic is just a fancy word for something that is a simpler but good enough approximation of something much more complicated or slow. In this case, an approximation of an opponent with relevant but fairly basic interaction. So to keep ally strategies from getting out of hand, I make the assumption that a well-prepared opponent will kill any ally that doesn't have either immortality or stealth during their main phase. And with that, my simulation issues were actually mostly solved. But there is still one glaring issue. Remember how I said that the Maximin algorithm assumes you have complete information, and that meant knowing the top cards of the opponent's deck? Well, that also means it would know the top cards of my deck too. So if I use Maximin directly, the tool would be useless for practice since, in a real situation, I can't know what the top card of my deck is. So to compromise, I made another heuristic. I made the program assume that it would only draw into do-nothing fire element cards with a cost of 9, which I refer to as a fire brick. This would let it use draw and discard effects to set up cards with special abilities like Rending Flames or Verucan Soul Knife, which both require that you banish fire cards from the graveyard, but do it in a way that was realistic enough for practice purposes. So after having what seemed like a reasonable simulation of FiZa and his opponent, I needed to speed up my program. With simple hands, it would take a few minutes to run, but for trickier hands, it could take a couple of hours. And while this wouldn't be a big problem if I knew that the program was definitely correct, there were sure to be bugs, and having testing loops that took potentially hours was not an option. So I decided to start with the basics. The first optimization is to simply avoid redoing work that we have already done before, since this actually comes up really often for these types of problems. To give a simple example of why this is actually super useful, let's say that we have 2 Kingdom Informants on the board, and no damage has been dealt to our opponent. In line 1, we attack with the one on the left, and then the one on the right, and so we end up with both rested and having dealt 2 damage. In line 2, we attack with the one on the right, and then the one on the left, and so we end up with both rested and having dealt 2 damage. The issue here is that to the computer, these are 2 completely unique lines, and it will pretend like they are completely unrelated, despite ending up in the same state. So instead, we have the computer figure out the best line for the first one, but then we save the answer for later. That way, once we get to the second line, we can just copy the answer we used before instead of computing it again. For anyone curious, this technique is most often called dynamic programming, though don't ask me why it's called that. There's another similar technique that we can apply to speed up the program, but this one is for giving up on obviously bad lines instead of saving results for later. To illustrate, let's go back to our Kingdom Informant example. Once again, we have 2 Kingdom Informants on the board, and no damage has been dealt to the opponent. In line 1, we attack with the one on the left, then the one on the right, dealing a total of 2 damage, and then we go to the wake up phase of turn 2, and both informants are now awake. In line 2, we simply pass without attacking, dealing a total of 0 damage, and then we go to our wake up phase of turn 2, and both informants are still awake. See the problem? In both lines, we have ended up on turn 2 with 2 Kingdom Informants awake on the board, but in one of them, we've already dealt 2 damage, and the other we have dealt none. Since there are currently no cards that have different effects based off of the number of damage counters your opponents have, we can know that line 2 is strictly worse than line 1, allowing us to give up on the line where we chose not to attack. For those wondering, I believe this technique is usually called alpha-beta pruning, though again, don't ask me why it's called that. They're both kind of funny but unintuitive names. Now you might be thinking that dynamic programming and alpha-beta pruning shouldn't save that much time, but actually, since the computer really does consider those all unique lines and redoes its work so often as a result, the time savings are massive. Just disabling both of those features in my final program took a hand from taking 3.1 seconds and 1.6 million states reached, all the way back up to 25 minutes and 1.2 billion states reached. So the program is almost 500 times faster with just dynamic programming and alpha-beta pruning added for that hand. And keep in mind that this 25 minutes is with all of my other speedups still in place. Without them, this hand would have likely taken hours if not days to run, if I had no optimizations implemented. Aside from the huge speed gains, what makes dynamic programming and alpha-beta pruning great is that they can be applied basically anytime the Maximin algorithm is used. But at this point, I still needed more speed. So now let's talk about the optimizations that required knowledge about Grand Archive. One easy optimization is to just force the program to use the Poison Dagger as the first thing in the turn. Poison Dagger amplifies damage, so you just want to amplifying as much damage as possible. Without this optimization, the program would try popping the dagger between every other action, leading to a lot of wasted computer power. In a similar vein, having Arthur attack as the first action in the main phase also saves a good amount of time. Arthur is an ally that boosts the damage of other allies, but only when he's rested. So, like Poison Dagger, delaying Arthur's attack will only ever result in less damage. And I know this might seem obvious, but again, to a computer, it's really not. The computer's only way to guarantee mathematical correctness without this kind of expert knowledge is just trying every possible line in every possible order. Another ally optimization was just attacking in bulk. So if any ally attacked, then all allies that could attack would attack immediately, without considering activating any cards or regalia in between. Without this, the program would try to attack in every possible order, and also weave in things like activating Mercenary's Blade or just using other cards, which for FiZa doesn't matter, outside of attacking with Arthur first. So this too saves way more time than it feels like it should. Another big pain point for the program was cards with draw and discard effects like Korhazi Courier and Hasty Messenger. You see, the number of lines you need to test increases exponentially with the number of choices that you can make. And when you discard something, each card from your hand is a different choice, which makes the possibility space basically blow up. But this can be wrangled in. You see, the only time discarding something provides value is when it can either 1. Be used to put fire in the graveyard for things like Rending Flames or Soul Knife, or 2. Be used to put classless floating memory in the graveyard to level up. Outside of that, the specific card doesn't really even matter. So this made the 9-cost do-nothing fire bricks from the top deck quite useful for optimization. Since they can't do anything, they could be automatically chosen as a discard target to fulfill the fire element criteria, but without coming at the cost of not being able to play a real card. So if a fire brick could be discarded, I had the program try discarding that and then skipped any fire element cards without floating memory. This was an especially good improvement for Korhazi Courier, who is guaranteed to draw a fire brick before discarding. The last gameplay optimization I made was to just have allies always attack, if possible, as soon as they are played. Otherwise, the computer would try things like playing 3 Clumsy Apprentices, but never attacking with them. Now, some astute viewers may be ready to say, actually, isn't there a situation where this isn't optimal? And that would be when you have Arthur and a Clumsy Apprentice with a 7-card hand. And to that, I would say that you're technically correct, but in practice, not mathematically correct. And here's why. Normally, with a 7-card hand, if you play Arthur, you can't afford to play any allies that cost at least 2, since you only have 2 cards left in your hand. Similarly, if you play a 2-cost ally, you can't afford to play Arthur afterwards, since you would only have 4 cards left in your hand, instead of the 5 total needed to play Arthur. But Clumsy Apprentice is different. Clumsy Apprentice is a 2-cost ally that makes you draw a card on enter. This means that instead of only having 4 cards left in your hand, after playing a Clumsy, you have 5, just enough to pay for and then play Arthur. So the highest damage 1-turn line with these 2 cards is achieved by playing Clumsy Apprentice, not attacking with her, playing Arthur, attacking with Arthur, and then attacking with the Clumsy Apprentice so that you can get Arthur's power boost on her attack, for a total of 4 damage instead of the 3 you would deal if you were attacking with the Clumsy immediately. But here's the thing. I'm optimizing for 3-turn dagger lines, so you only really get 2 opportunities to make this play, and neither one of them really works out. The first opportunity is turn 1, but on turn 1 you can't attack, so attacking immediately is irrelevant. Going Clumsy into Arthur would just be a line to help you get extra fire in the graveyard. The second opportunity is turn 2. With 7 cards, you could easily play Clumsy, attack, then play Arthur, most likely immortalizing him, for a total of 1 damage instead of 2. But this doesn't take into account the consequences of banishing cards from your memory when you level up. You see, when leveling up to Xander 1, something that you have to do to use Poison Dagger, you almost never have classless floating memory available. So you have to banish something at random from your memory. Except to the computer, it's not actually random. The computer will leave nothing up to chance. The computer is trying to maximize the minimum possible damage, so it must assume that whatever gets banished was the single most valuable card in your memory. Let's assume for a moment that the 6 cards we put into memory to pay for Arthur and Clumsy were 2 Rokokos, 2 Arthurs, and 2 Fire Bricks. And to maximize damage, we've actually made Arthur immortal rather than swinging. When we level up to Xander 1, what we'd like to be banished is either a Fire Brick or Arthur, since we can't really use those anyways. This would let us play 2 Rokokos next turn, and with the Arthur and Poison Dagger boost, would be a total of 12 damage from hand. But that's not what will happen. The program has to assume that the worst possible card is going to be banished for us, so we would have to say goodbye to Rokoko. So going into the dagger turn, our our hand would become 1 Rococo, 2 Arthurs, and 3 fire bricks. So we would just play the 1 Rococo and deal 6 damage from our hand instead of 12, unable to pay for any other cards. This is 6 damage less than we would have hoped for from hand, and 4 damage less than if we had just not played the Clumsy and held the 2 Rococos in hand when leveling up. So while making the optimal Clumsy into Arthur lines seems like it would lead to mathematically incorrect lines, I expect that in the overwhelming majority of situations, if not all of them, putting your entire hand down into your memory before leveling up would not be mathematically correct anyways. So I'm okay with making that specific interaction maybe not mathematically correct, so that I save a bunch of extra time for my program. The last notable optimization I made was actually more of a data structure optimization. To do the dynamic programming and alpha beta pruning, I had to use a hash map to store the data. Hash maps do some fancy math stuff to convert a key, which in this case is a representation of the board state, into a pseudo-random number to help speed up the data structure. However, this conversion was really expensive, and it was happening millions of times over the course of the simulation. But why was it so expensive? Well, remember how I said earlier that I was just making stuff slow but definitely correct? Well, originally I was just using strings to represent the board state, and they were probably at least 40 characters long, so super inefficient. I could do better. You see, most values like weapon durability could be represented by really small numbers, so they only needed 1 to 3 bits instead of the full character. So I took all the stuff that was being represented as separate characters and packed them together into just 2 64-bit integers. With 40 characters, it would probably take about 40 operations to compute the hash code. But for 2 integers, it was more like just 2. So I'd guess that the new hashcode operation was about 5% of the original amount of work, or about 20 times faster. Though I'll admit, I didn't actually benchmark the hashing functions by themselves, so that 20 times faster is just a guess. It could be more, and it could be less. What I did benchmark though was the runtime of my program. To my surprise, this optimization on its own sped up my program by almost 2 times. According to a comment in my code, it took my performance issues hand from about 51 seconds down to just 28, so about 80% faster than it was before. So now that we're done with the optimizations, let's take a look at the output. With my program, I could generate hundreds of opening hands and their mathematically correct lines. This then let me make a little website for myself to use for practicing. I could see an opening hand, try to figure out the line, check the max damage, and then if it wasn't right, I could see what I needed to do to truly maximize the hurt. Now let's take a look at my results since switching to FiZa and beginning to work on my strong steel brain. I wasn't able to finish the simulation in time for regionals, but working through debugging my program and even being able to see and then debug what FiZa was capable of with just most of his tools was actually pretty great, and it let me make much better decisions in my matches. I went undefeated at locals the Wednesday before regionals, and then at regionals, I was able to go 4-1 in the first 5 rounds, which then let me intentionally draw the last round to secure 5th place, and earn my second regional invite card. With regionals out of the way, my next goal was making day 2 at nationals. I spent a good chunk of time between regionals and nationals finishing up and then optimizing my program, so that I was able to generate drills and use them to practice. Finally able to polish my weak flesh brain into something closer to steel. Though I will admit, I actually only had the time to run through a couple hundred drills by the time nationals came around, and I would have liked to run much more. But anyways, time stops for no one, and soon enough, it was time for nationals. Since my goal was to make day 2, I would need a total of 16 points, or in other words, 5 wins and 1 draw. Though, as is always the case, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and mathematically correct FiZa lines are no different. Well, actually, except for one of my games and one of my rounds. I did actually have a single line that did survive contact, and it was extremely satisfying. I was going second into a Fractals player, and upon seeing my opening hand, I quickly ran the lines and had a realization. If they don't clear my allies and level up on their next turn, I think I can just close out the game on my second turn. I didn't write it down, but I think the opening hand was something like Xiao Xiao, Red Hair, Rococo, Blazing Throw, Ignited Stab, and 3 other cards that didn't matter, probably veteran Blaze Bearers. Turn 1 would be play Red Hair, play Xiao Xiao, swing with Red Hair for 3, swing with Xiao Xiao for 1, and if all that went through, the turn 2 kill was still very possible, and it would be time to Ignited Stab for 2 more damage, for a total of 6 damage dealt. Then, if they didn't level up, Or if they leveled up, but without killing Xiao Xiao or Red Hair, I'd have them on turn 2. Turn 2 would be grab Impact Hammer, swing at them for 2, throw it with Blazing Throw for 4, play Rococo, deal 2 damage on enter, and then swing Rococo for 1. For a total of 9 damage that turn, 15 total if Xiao Xiao and Red Hair were killed, and exactly lethal if they didn't level up. Or exactly lethal if they did level up, but didn't kill Xiao Xiao or Red Hair. In the case where they'd both leveled up and cleared an ally, I'd be able to pivot into another line by either grabbing a Safeguard Amulet for safety, or a Poison Dagger to try putting a clock on the match or forcing out a Fracturize. But they didn't level up, and I got the game. After the match, they admitted that they just didn't think it was possible for me to kill them that fast, and I don't blame them. At this point, I had put the better part of 2 months into both researching and practicing my FiZa lines, and I was sure they hadn't done the same. But that was just one game where my line survived. How did the others go? Well, like regionals, in my first 5 rounds, I managed to lose my first match and then win the next 4. Though at nationals, all my wins were versus Fractal players, the hardest round being my match versus Rex from Chess Club. Though, unlike regionals, this wasn't enough to reach my goal. To reach day 2 at nationals, you needed 16 points. You get 3 for winning a round and just 1 point for drawing. So I had 12 points with 3 rounds left. To make day 2, I would need to at least win 1 and then draw 1 to get the extra 4 points that I needed. So I just needed to win one of my next 2 rounds, since I was sure my opponent would intentionally draw to make day 2 if given the chance. But I wasn't able to get there, and I ended the day with 4 wins and 3 losses. So what went wrong? The most frustrating loss was my first of the day, in round 1 versus a Wind Shadow Strike Tristan. This is where running drills is no substitute for playing real games. And while I would have known how to play this matchup as Merlin, I hadn't navigated it much if at all from the FiZa's perspective. In game 1, I ended up just 1 damage shy of lethal, and then got killed on the next turn. But it's a game I should have won, because I blundered when killing arrested Asen Protector. Asen Protector is a 3 power 4 life ally that could ruin my day if I left it alone. When dealing with it, I ended up hitting it for 1 with a Hasty Messenger, using Vermilion Decree for another 2, and then an unprepped Ignited Stab for another 2 damage, dealing a total of 5 damage to a 4 life ally. If I had just sent that extra 1 point of damage at their champion, the Asen would have still died, and I would have closed the 1 damage gap that I needed for lethal that game. I then lost the second game, and with it, round 1. My other 2 losses I feel a lot less bad about. The first was versus a Fire Lorraine player that made excellent use of a card that my mathematically correct lines could not account for, and a card that I honestly just wasn't expecting a Fire Lorraine player to even be running. Demolition. Demolition is a 3 cost 3 damage spell that can be played at fast speed. Being a 3 damage spell means that it could be used to kill any of my allies, even the ones with stealth, and it being fast meant that it could be done in the middle of my turn, not just their main phase. They used Demolition to completely derail some of my lines by killing Arthurs and Red Hairs when I really wasn't ready for it. Between that and otherwise playing the matchup pretty well, they ended up taking the round, though I did get at least 1 game off of them, which was much better than my next and final loss for the day. My last opponent for the day was on Serene Fire Luxem Xander. The things that can make this matchup hard are his reusable, resource neutral ally removal, and his crazy good healing. Thieving Cut is a 3 power assassin attack that on hit draws Xander a card. Since the highest life ally in my deck has 3 life, it can be used to kill any of my allies that do not have stealth, while also drawing the Luxem Xander player a card. To make things worse, the Luxem Xander player can just do it again by using their level 2 ability, which lets them get it back from their graveyard and then just do it again, allowing them to clear another non-stealth ally while staying neutral in resources. My opponent was able to double play a Thieving Cut in both of our games, and if it was just that, I might have been able to push through and win the match, but it wasn't. There's also his crazy good healing. You see, the Serene part in Serene Luxem Xander comes from their choice to use the Serene Spirit of Fire, which lets them recover 6 once per game, effectively increasing their health pool by 24%. And while certainly powerful, that's not the most difficult recovery to overcome. The most difficult recovery is Luxem Sight. Luxem Sight is a card that, when revealed in their memory, makes the Luxem Xander player recover 3 health. This combos very well with the level 3 ability of Xander Blinding Steel, which lets them reveal their memory once per turn for free. However, they also have cards in their deck like Uncover the Plot, which let them reveal their memory additional times. In both of our games, my opponent had 2 Luxem sites when they reached level 3, and they did their free reveal. And in both of our games, they also had a way to immediately reveal them again. So, healing for an additional 12 for a total of 18 with the Serene Spirit. Plus, they'd be able to recover another 6 damage each turn at minimum. So, I was just cooked, and I lost that round too. There was still 1 round left, but I was unable to qualify for day 2, so I decided to drop from the tournament, take a break, and get back to my mathematically correct FiZa research. More on that towards the end of the video. With Nationals over, my last goal was making day 2 at the Ascent Worlds 3 vs 3. The Ascent Worlds 3 vs 3 is a huge event that Weaves of the Shore holds once a year. What makes it special is that instead of the normal 1 vs 1 best of 3 matches, people get together in teams of 3 and then simultaneously play 3 best of 1 matches, with the first team to 2 wins taking the round. For round 1, I was hoping we'd get paired into some more casual players, but after I saw my round 1 opponent, I knew we'd be in for a tough fight. Sitting across from me was the legend himself, Matt G. You see, Matt G is an exceptional player. He's one of the few players to take first place at multiple Ascent level tournaments. He took a 2nd place finish at the North American Nationals last year, and I suspect is the main person responsible for getting Erupting Rhapsody banned. Why he wasn't in the World Championship tournament, I couldn't say, but I did know that this would not be an easy win. To my surprise, he was on Serene Fire Arcane Rye, a deck that I was familiar with, but also the deck that was my only loss at the Texas Regionals. And to make things worse, I had removed all of my tech cards that would have been good versus Rye from my deck. But why? What I didn't mention before was that the 3v3 also has another gimmick. The deck building restrictions that you would normally apply to just one player applies across all 3 people in the entire team. And this meant that only 1 player got the Safeguard Amulet on my team, and that player was not me. Safeguard Amulet is a 0-cost regalia that for 1 entire turn reduces all non-combat damage dealt to your champion. Rye's entire game plan is to blow up his opponent with non-combat damage, something that would be greatly hindered by Safeguard Amulet, if only I'd had it. To make matters worse, I had traded in my Blanches for Demolitions. Blanche is an ally that I ran for both regionals and nationals with a really good ability versus Rye. As long as she's alive, Blanche reduces all non-combat damage dealt both to your champion and your non-Blanche allies. And with 99% of Rye's damage being non-combat, this would have been a huge boon. So then why did I make the swap? Well, Rye isn't very popular, and Fractals got a card banned after Nationals, so I was much less afraid of non-combat damage and much more worried about aggro decks. So I decided to grab Demolition instead, the card that had greatly disrupted my plan at Nationals. I figured it would serve to make my deck more consistent and give me options for disrupting other aggro decks. But man, did I wish I had Blanche for this matchup. With that in mind, I figured my best chance of winning would be to just hit him as hard as I could, as fast as I could, while avoiding big hitters like Rending Flames after he hit level 3. But why would I want to avoid big damage? Well, the answer is Spell Shield Arcane. Spell Shield Arcane is a defensive tool that Rye can use after he hits level 3 that turns a single instance of damage into an equal number of enlightenment counters. And the more enlightenment counters Rye has, the more cards he gets to draw. So if I did a single big hit, Arcane Spell Shield would not only prevent all of that damage, but also turn it into Rye drawing a lot of cards. So with that in mind, I had a basic game plan, but unfortunately, there was another card that I had completely forgotten about. A card that Rye loves to run, and that I would blunder into enabling. But more on that later. Where I felt the match reached its tipping point was slightly before that. I forgot exactly how we got there, but as far as I remember, this is what happened. Matt was sitting at 23 damage with just 2 life remaining. Though that wasn't quite true since he could still use his Serene Spirit to recover 6. This is probably where I would have grabbed Safeguard Amulet if I had had it. But with that not being an option, I was looking to just close out the game if I could. So I grabbed Impact Hammer. I would swing with the hammer for 2 damage, force him to use his Serene Spirit to recover 6, and then try to finish him off with a Planted Explosives for 2 damage before the recovery took effect. So I went for the swing, he Lineage Released to recover 6, I used Planted Explosives to try to kill him before the recover could resolve, and then he used Arcane Spell Shield so that the Planted Explosives would be prevented, and he would ultimately live through my attack. So instead of finishing him off, he was now at 19 damage, but without his Serene Spirit. Still a winnable position. And I think I still had an ally or 2 on board, so I decided to swing them to push just a little more damage out. taking him to 21 damage in total. Now, longtime Grand Archive players will probably know what my blunder was, and that was taking him above 19 damage when I wasn't ready to finish the job. The card I alluded to before is Chalice of Blood. Chalice of Blood is a zero-cost regalia that lets you draw 2 cards. Drawing 2 cards is crazy good, especially for a zero cost, which is why the draw effect can only be activated in dire situations. To draw the 2 cards, your champion must have at least 20 damage counters on them, enough damage to kill any level 1 champion, and for most other champions to be on the verge of death. So by moving him from 19 to 21, I unlocked the draw effect for him on his turn. And while I don't know for sure if this was really the deciding factor in our game, I'd like to believe it was, since Chalice of Blood is something I've had the presence of mind to play into in the past, and something that would have been in my control. But in the end, Matt was able to just barely survive my next turn, and with 1 life remaining, he was able to blast me into the Shadow Realm. That said, it was a really fun game, and while I did ultimately lose, I feel pretty good about being able to get Matt within 1 life of dying. I'm not a top player, and I was not expecting to win that game, and certainly wasn't expecting it to be that close, so I'm pretty happy with how I performed. The next couple of rounds went more smoothly, for the most part. We won our next 2 rounds, putting us at 2 wins and 1 loss. And then we got to round 4. The name for our next opponent was Henki and the Ops? After seeing the name for our pairings, we were wondering who it was. Surely it was some friend of Henki and not the man himself. But as we approached our table, it became clear that it was not a joke. Sitting across from us was Henki, EMP, and TTA. 3 people that were currently competing for the title of Grand Archive World Champion. My match was versus TTA, someone that I didn't recognize at the time, but someone that I definitely would have if I had been keeping up with the GA streams properly. TTA is obviously a high caliber player, at the time having taken 6th place in Ascent Seattle, 2nd place in the Southeast Asia Nationals, and securing 9th place in the 2025 Grand Archive World Championship Tournament. And to make things worse, he was on Water Genbu, a deck which, while popular, I didn't actually have that much experience into. And this would really backfire on me later. So knowing that I was against a player that was not only much better than myself, but surely much more familiar with the matchup, I decided that I should probably just push as hard as I could, not respect interaction as much as I usually do, and just hope for the best. You see, before the tournament, I had talked briefly with my team about what we should do if we got matched up into world champion contenders. There had been world champion contenders pop up in the 3v3 last year, and while we didn't get paired into them then, there was always a chance it would happen today. The consensus was that we'd probably get outplayed and almost certainly lose playing our normal game. So against really good opponents, the basic plan was to just play super aggressively and just hope to high roll them. Or in other words, Joey Wheeler them. Joey Wheeler is a character from Yu-Gi-Oh! That is famous for winning games he has no business winning. In the show, he's a total novice, but he's able to win just because he gets really lucky. If we were going to win the round, it was going to be off the back of a lot of luck. No disrespect to myself or my teammates, but none of us are top players. None of us have taken 1st place at a store championship, none of us have made day 2 at a nationals, none of us have made day 2 at an Ascent, and I'm the only player on our team that has made top cut at a regional. So with that in mind, it was time to start the round. TTA was, unsurprisingly, playing pretty well. What was truly surprising though, was that our plan seemed to be working. Perfect Calcium, our B player, had defeated Henki? What? I don't remember exactly what happened. All I know is that Perfect Calcium did robot things, dealt like 10 damage in 1 turn at some point. Henki said something like, "Oh man, I'm cooked," and the round was over. And I acknowledge that I could ask Calcium about what exactly happened, but I think it's funnier if I don't. But anyways, back to my game. I don't remember too much, but what I do remember is that I totally outplayed myself and I was making huge blunders. You see, rather than stick to the plan, I tried to get fancy. The worst of it that I remember was when I was level 1 and staring down a buffed up Frostborn Paladin. To make things worse, it was awake and ready to intercept my attacks. So I wanted that Paladin dead. So I sent a prepped Ignited Stab at his champion for 4. Wait, I sent a prepped Ignited Stab at his champion for 4? Didn't I want the Paladin dead? Well, you see, my weak flesh brain somehow got it into its head that he would be forced to intercept with his Paladin, rather than take my attack directly. So rather than attack his Paladin directly, I would do something cool and go for his champion to force him to intercept with his Paladin, and then his Paladin would die. I really have no idea how I made such a boneheaded mistake, but he did the right thing and just let the attack through to his champion. And then I had to send a few allies at his paladin to clear it, and he killed one of my allies as a result, and yeah, it was just bad. To make matters worse, I think I might have hit his champion with my poison dagger first, though to be honest, I just don't remember what I did with my dagger. All I remember was feeling like I had basically just wasted it. Though my third and final blunder was getting my Rending Flames negated by a Song of Frost. This is where my lack of matchup knowledge really bit me. You see, Song of Frost is a 2-cost water spell that says if a unit is attacking, end the combat phase. Rending Flames is a 3-cost, 3-power fire attack with a really powerful secondary effect. It lets you double the damage of the attack if you banish 3 fire cards from your graveyard as an on-attack trigger. Due to the timing of things, you can actually play Song of Frost to negate the attack, but after the FiZa player has already committed to banishing their 3 cards. So it's something that I'm always considering when I'm playing into water. And fortunately for me, TTA only had 1 card in his hand, so I was safe. He couldn't play Song of Frost or really any negates. I'd be able to deal like 8 or 10 damage next turn without the risk of any interaction. Or so I thought. You see, negating a combat phase isn't the only text on Song of Frost. It also has an option to ignore paying its normal costs. So then, why didn't I consider that? Well, the ability to ignore its normal cost is locked behind the Tamer class bonus. So non-Tamer champions can't use it. And for most of Grand Archive's history, Water Tamer has not been competitively viable. So it's just something that I wasn't thinking about. So with all of that not in mind, I went for my Rending Flames, banishing my 3 fire cards, and got it negated by a Song of Frost. At this point, the game was basically over, though let's be clear, I also just was not playing super well up until that point. And so while my team did getting 1 game win, we would ultimately lose the round. Though if you're gonna losing to world champion contenders ain't too bad. Though I was still frustrated. Not with losing, but with my own blunders. Because, you know, if I'm gonna lose, I'd at least want to do it playing my best game and not outplaying myself. That said, we still actually had a shot at making day 2, but the next round was also going to be tough. We got paired into some players from our local scene, and I got paired into Mr. Mishida. Mr. Mishida is a Water Kongming player. I have had exactly 1 easy win versus him, and in every other match, I've had to fight for my life. This was not the 1 easy win. Rather than relive the brutal fight, I'm just going to gloss over the game and start from the end of his last turn. I had fought through 2 buffed up Frostborn Paladins, I had demolished and stormed a frozen citadel, and I had put a Beast Soul Visage onto a Fierce Princess since I did not have the means to kill it, and it would have otherwise torn me and my allies to shreds. And I was now getting hit for 6 by an Ardent Cloud Striker, putting me at 16 damage out of 19 life. To make matters worse, Mr. Mishida had a Hydro Guard Retainer on the field, making it harder for me to go for the kill. Though, as bad as this seemed, I still had some upsides. I had already grabbed smoke bombs and it had not been fracturized, and I still had my dagger nestled safely under my grail and ready to go. My downside was that my entire hand was in my memory and there were only 3 cards. 2 cards with no hopes of dealing enough damage to kill him, probably veteran Blaze Bearers, and a single Rococo. To make matters worse, I think he had like 2 or 3 cards in his hand, which could have been a Song of Frost, Frostbind, or maybe a Tidal Lock. So while staring down the barrel of a Cloud Striker, I had to win on my next turn, or die on his next turn. My only safe-ish option seemed to be grabbing a Blinding Orb to stop his potential negates. Hope that I didn't banish my Rococo paying its costs, and then top deck another copy of Rococo with one of my 3 draws in that turn, and then just swing out. And luckily for me, that's exactly what happened. This line was certainly not mathematically correct, but it got the job done. Though fortunately for me, my other teammates had actually already won their games just before my potential demise, and we were actually just finishing out the game to see who would have won. At that point, we were at 3 wins and 2 losses. 1 more loss would mean that we were out of contention for day 2, and unfortunately, we just didn't get our next round, putting us at 3 wins and 3 losses, meaning that we could at most get to 15 out of the 16 points needed to make day 2. If it had been just me, I might have dropped from the tournament like I did at Nationals. That way I'd be able to go play draft or do other Ascenti type things. But instead, my teammates wanted to lock in Platinum for the season, so we kept gaming. And it's a good thing we did, because we won our last 2 rounds and ended the day with 5 rounds won and 3 lost. And my personal game record was 6 wins and 2 losses, only dropping games versus Matt G and TTA. So overall, I'd say mathematically correct FiZa was actually a really useful tool. While I did only manage to meet one of the 3 goals I had set for myself, I'm still pretty happy with how I performed. I was on the cusp of making it to day 2 in Nationals, and my team ended up just 1 point shy of making day 2 in the 3v3. And that's after getting paired into Matt G's team and a team full of world champion contenders. Where mathematically correct FiZa lines fell short was exactly where I expected it to, and that was matchup knowledge. Unsurprisingly, in a game with as much interaction as Grand Archive, getting really familiar with matchups and then playing into them with your deck is super important, and my tool doesn't currently help with that. Something that I do think it could help with though is deck building. For aggro decks especially, being able to benchmark the amount of damage it can dish out seems super useful, and when combined with hill climbing or other optimization techniques, I think it could be used to at least make the core of a deck. Though I will admit, I've actually already tried this. What I've ended up with so far, I think on average was maybe like half a point of damage higher on average. But to get that half point, the deck got pretty silly. It basically turned FiZa into Spellslinger FiZa, filling the deck with a bunch of spells. And here's why. As far as the program is concerned, without factoring in Arthur or Red Hair, which are pretty inconsistent, the 1-2 stealth allies and 2-3 regular allies are basically the same damage as the fast speed 2 damage spells, but much less flexible. They can both only deal 2 to 3 damage by turn 3 when going first, but spells are much more flexible since they can be played on Recollection or on an opponent's turn. I did try to run the list at locals one week, but it unsurprisingly gets blown out pretty bad by Safeguard Amulet, though the Sparklights do help. I'll leave a link to some of the mathematically correct FiZa lines that I thought were more interesting, and Spellslinger FiZa in a pinned comment. And if you want more mathematically correct FiZa lines, then just have some fun and do it yourself. I've got to say something for me, since this is a competitive game after all, and it took me a lot of time to get it right and optimize it. Also, huge shout out to Tsovotl, aka Wham. He's a longtime FiZa player that helped me a lot with sanity checking my simulation code when I still had a ton of bugs. Plus, he made for a pretty good rubber ducky. He's a good friend, and I don't think I would have gotten it done in time for Nationals without his help. And if you thought this video was interesting, please do take a few seconds to leave a comment. And if you don't know what to say, Apple Grape would be lovely. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.